Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te mata peak tuku maunga, ko tuki tuki tuku awa, ko te moana nui a kiwa tuku moana. Ko no hiratonga ahau, kei te raki pai whenua taku kāinga I nāianei. Ko Helen Hedges taku ingoa, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all very much for choosing to come along today. As Justine said, it feels like it's been a long 18 months since we've been in touch with our professional community and our support crew in many cases. So we're delighted to have you either here in person or attending virtually today. As Justine just said, my research program has, I guess, centred on developing more analytical and theorised interpretations of the term children's interests. And that question of whose and which interests create curriculum leads me today to presenting a little bit more emphasis about teacher interests. The term children's interests, and indeed early childhood more broadly, has kind of suffered a little bit from some long-standing ideas. These have come from and been influenced by ideas about play activities, child-centredness and child development theories that are founded in developmental psychology. These ideas have kind of suffered from multiple ambiguous interpretations, but when it comes to children's interests, commonly taken at a surface level to mean choices of play activities within a well-resourced environment. Both of these ideas position learning as happening naturally, and they position teachers as observers, resource providers and facilitators. And when we look at what they're facilitating, it's often more equipment and resources. So, a positive point about all of this that we wouldn't want to move away from is that children are absolutely central to thinking about curriculum and pedagogy. But learning does not happen naturally. You can all cite it with me. It happens through respectful, reciprocal and responsive relationships with people, places and things. The next problem then is that it leaves teachers wondering about their own personal and professional knowledge and what input they can have into children's learning. Another problem that's arisen is that child-centredness has often been viewed in a binary and oppositional relationship to teacher-centred activities, where often teacher-centred is interpreted as instructional and didactic. So people have quite rightly been concerned by those approaches, but in doing so, then also often rejected the word teacher or teaching to describe their work, leaving them to be uncertain about an identity as a teacher and how they might proactively use some of their knowledge during interactions with children. So coupled with a lack of policy commitment to qualified teachers, it's perhaps no wonder teachers have been uncertain about their roles and identities as teachers and under-recognised their own contributions to curriculum and pedagogy and perhaps used titles for their work other than teacher. I certainly realised during my projects that teacher interests were important in what happened, but perhaps hadn't emphasised that myself, given my quest to foster deeper and more analytical understandings of the term children's interests. Recently then, I've gone back to bring to the fore the way teacher interests are used in curriculum and pedagogy. But when I went to kind of test my growing hypotheses and concerns, I could only locate 3 studies that described links between teacher interests, children's interests and student learning. One project was located in the secondary sector around teachers of foreign languages and intercultural competence in England. During narrative interviews, some of these teachers revealed that they had clear personal interests that influenced their decision-making, and that these interests motivated some students to become more engaged in the topics taught. For example, one teacher had a strong interest in history, and he introduced this to students by incorporating historical figures and places in dramatic stories he told about languages and cultures in his teaching. He sounds like a fun teacher to me. However, His managers were not always happy with these curricular and pedagogical decisions, but he persisted because he saw the way his teaching inspired interest in students. Alati in the US, in a teacher-led program, noted that while children's interests remained paramount in what he provided, that his own enjoyment of teaching occurred when his own interests were involved. He suggested that these opportunities enabled children to see teachers model the excitement of interest-related learning. And one example he included was his interest in cooking, where he showed how he could incorporate the expected domain-based knowledge of literacy, arts, science and maths into his teaching and enthuse children at the same time. Hello, Zoe and Ben. It's all right. Suzanne Manning and Judith Loveridge's study took place in a play centre in New Zealand. So this study explored when and why the parents at the play centre used their interests and associated knowledge during interactions with children. The study found that where parents used their interests, involvement levels and the language parents used in interactions with children increased in quality and quantity. Of significance in relation to child-centredness, that was the philosophy of the setting, the authors also found a lot of evidence that teachers the adults overlooked their own interests, focusing on the provision of a rich activities-based environment that met the philosophy and values of the setting. So this suggested that constraints such as taken for granted, perhaps surface-level child-centred practices, discouraged the interests from being used more broadly. The authors wondered if teachers needed to sense permission to use their interests more overtly in curricular provision. So I became aware through various projects that teachers' interests were present in curriculum and pedagogy. They created rich curriculum and learning, but weren't documented as influences. So this underplayed their role. Now, secondary analysis of data has become accepted in qualitative work as a way to make make the most of the rich data obtained. And you can reanalyse with a new question or lens. This method's been rightly accompanied by some robust epistemological, methodological and ethical debates. But all I'll say for now is that I got around those because the problems of fit, context and verification didn't apply so much to projects that I had actually been involved in, which is quite different from just picking up a data set. So in reanalysing 4 qualitative projects, I found that teachers' interests contributed many of the experiences provided, but were less frequently documented as such. And during interviews, the teachers revealed that documenting their interests was in tension with these child-centred or initiated philosophies. So this meant that the potential of children's learning was either unrealised or under-engaged with, or when it was engaged with, it was under-recognised and under-documented. So I'll just present a few examples. The first is where teacher interests obviously add to curricular offerings. So in one study, Christine's interest in dance and Teresia's in sewing, and Louise, who's on the live stream, hi Louise, in health, fitness and cooking, each contributed to the curriculum in a sustained way. Christine held kind of regular dancing preparation and practice for an annual winter disco for several months. Teresia made capes with the children that were used subsequently in quite complex socio-dramatic play, and Louise cooked with the children every Friday. So their knowledge and enthusiasm were absolutely vital to what was going on. As another example, teachers' interests can deepen pedagogical interactions. At a different setting, Barbara identified walking, gardening and photography as personal interests. In an interview, she elaborated on gardening as an interest, as is on that slide. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when she talked about her own interests, she nominated biology as a secondary school subject of particular interest to her. And that interest provided subject knowledge that she used to respond to children's interests and inquiries in her teaching. For example, on one occasion, 2-year-old Imogen wanted to find a caterpillar, something I'm sure you're familiar with. Barbara took the opportunity to help a number of children distinguish between the habitats, eating and, of course, excreting practices of caterpillars, snails and aphids. On another day, they went for a walk to a neighbouring park, and the children noticed and asked a lot of questions about birds, insects and trees, and Barbara named them for them, including sometimes at the request of other teachers who didn't know what they were. So there were multiple examples where teacher interest, expertise and knowledge enriched interests and provided curricular activities or responses to children's spontaneous interests that went well beyond what children would achieve if it was left to child-centred notions of interests. The Treehouse project was a notable example of a long-term and co-constructed project. Teacher Daniel was a former engineer, and 4-year-old Peter knew exactly who to approach when he decided he wanted to build a treehouse. So of course Daniel was able to use his expertise to encourage planning and participation over a number of months. Here you see Peter's plan for the treehouse. And his interest sparked many, many other children's interests too from this project. But as noted earlier in relation to the teachers in the projects, Daniel expressed tensions and dilemmas and used a word that's elsewhere in the literature too, a fear of hijacking children's interests, an interesting term. As his comments show, he wrestled with how to have input to achieve children's goals without taking the power of the interest away from them. He wondered how to use his expert knowledge. Here you will see that he resolved his dilemma and justified his input, but how many other teachers are still wrestling with this dilemma? In addition, his role in the project was under-recognised in the enormous pedagogical documentation that went with it, and the same applied to the other examples that I've shared today. And as another example, teachers' cultural interests are important. We know that Te Whāriki places a responsibility on teachers to incorporate te reo and tikanga Māori in authentic ways so that children can learn aspects of their national language, culture and, I guess, a shared national identity. And in some settings, this interest may not arise spontaneously from children and therefore be considered child-centred. So Kylie and Louise were both interested in te reo and tikanga Māori and made efforts in their professional learning to learn more about both and bring that into the curriculum when it wasn't initiated by children. So they went well beyond teacher interests by enacting legitimate goals valued by a community and culture and showed how these could stimulate children's interests because children went on to reenact what they learned in their play later. Children also have a fundamental interest in developing and understanding their cultural identities. 4-year-olds Hunter and Simeon had a range of heritages to draw on in developing their cultural identities, including identifying features kind of a shared national cultural identity of what it meant to be New Zealanders, unsurprisingly perhaps via sport. You might be seeing a lot of that during the Olympics at the moment. So on one occasion, they explored these ideas spontaneously through inquiry about flags and national anthems played at sporting fixtures. When Simeon's questions got beyond the knowledge of the teacher he was with, she directed him to Rosie, a teacher who identified as Chilean. Rosie's own personal identity-based interests validated Simeon's and enabled him to pursue these with authenticity. In turn, Rosie later redirected him to a teacher who shared Simeon's Fijian heritage when he asked questions about their anthem in sport. So Rosie and Benita represent the way teachers' interests and associated knowledge are important in developing children's identities in a global world. So, in summary, my findings showed that teachers can be instigators, inspirers, responders and extenders of children's interests, employing their own interests and knowledge to do so. The findings also exemplify provision of a more challenging, authentic and responsive early childhood environment than traditional play activities as a result, without removing children's enjoyment of play or redirecting play for any pedagogical purposes. So I therefore argue that we need to think about repositioning children's interests, because empowerment and mana-enhancing practices are central to Te Whāriki. Children can act on their own interests and enjoy teacher-initiated experiences as well. And together, children and teachers can co-construct interest-based curriculum. Early childhood teachers' knowledge is broad. It draws on a range of disciplines as part of the professional knowledge to engage in relationship-based pedagogy. Teams of teachers can support each other with that knowledge, and as examples here show, children learn who to go to develop their own knowledge and interests. As Verity Campbell-Barr points out in this quote, the list of knowledge could be extensive and can celebrate just how much early childhood teachers draw on in their planned and spontaneous interactions with children. And I suggest that these interactions can be deeper where teacher interests and knowledge are fully included, and therefore that they ought to be acknowledged and included in pedagogical documentation that helps to articulate and justify what teachers do. Teacher knowledge also needs to go beyond child-centredness as a philosophy and child development as an underpinning theory, as they have stagnated some of our understandings. Further empirical studies that involve teachers as participants or collaborators will continue our understanding and theorising about curriculum as we reflect on, critique and keep creating new ideas about interest-based curriculum. In this way, we can shift from child-centred understandings of interest-based curriculum and acknowledge the role and importance of teacher interests and knowledge. Certainly, narrative studies have shown that aligning curriculum and pedagogy with the personal life experiences and values is an important component of a teacher identity. In negotiating a teacher identity, it's important that teachers can develop their own ways of how to be and act as teachers and ways to understand their work that acknowledges their experience and expertise. So validating the use of teacher interests is one way to own that label of teacher and develop an identity as a teacher. Some scholars have argued that teacher life experience must be front and centre of any thinking about teacher education, teacher development, teacher identity and teacher ongoing learning. So if that kind of attention were applied to early childhood education, while child-centred legacies could ensure that children do remain forefronted, teachers might also value what their own experiences, knowledge and interests and related knowledge could contribute, in ways the teachers in these 4 studies did not until their consciousness was raised about the role of their interests, because they feared that otherwise these contradicted the embedded child-centred beliefs and practices. And as I've said, teachers can then become teachers. So thank you for listening. I've just drawn on some of my own work here, and in particular chapter 8 of a book I am trying to finish writing as we speak. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Helen. From you, Kiri. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you. I hope you'll still be clapping at the end of my presentation. I just want to acknowledge the familiar faces in the audience. I can see past colleagues and present colleagues, fellow doctoral students, and teachers that I admire in the sector too. So that just makes it a little bit nerve-wracking, but I'll do my best. So as Helen said, this presentation comes from one aspect of findings from my doctoral thesis, which examined how teachers construct their teacher identities in the complex early childhood sector that we have in Aotearoa. And the beginnings of my project come from really my own participation in the sector, both as a teacher in both private and community-based settings, and then as a teacher educator. And just my own curiosity and observations about what happens when teachers transition into the sector and into these really diverse kinds of contexts, and are wondering about how they come to understand themselves and their work in these different contexts. And in particular, at the time when I was entering teacher education, the early childhood was becoming highly professionalised, highly regulated, and also highly privatised. So that kind of overarching context kind of set the frame for my questioning about teacher identities. So the research is a critical examination of those contexts and the influences that shape teachers' understandings of their work and themselves, and I decided to focus on this notion of teacher identities. So my doctoral thesis ended up being called Teacher Identities and the Complex Business of Early Childhood in Aotearoa. The research aim was to examine how teachers understand their work, commitments and priorities in a highly diverse, highly regulated and privatised landscape. And I used critical discourse analysis as both my theoretical and methodological kind of underpinnings for the research. And that fitted well with my research intentions, because my motivation for this research was really driven by wanting to, caring about teachers' work conditions and wellbeing and wanting to see some improvement in those. And critical discourse analysis has this kind of overtly political and emancipatory agenda, so that fitted well with what I wanted to do. So what I'm going to present to you is just one aspect of the findings. And so what I did overall in the thesis was a discourse analysis of key national early childhood policy texts, focus groups with early childhood teachers from across the sector. I think that one thing that my research has done that maybe hasn't been done before is bring together teachers from different contexts to talk about their work and their identity. So I had teachers in focus groups from corporate centres, from individual privately owned centres, from kindergartens, from community-based centres together, and it was really the dynamics of those conversations between teachers that some of this data has arisen from. And I also undertook interviews with centre managers, owners and teacher educators. Oops. So I wanted to talk about two particular identities that arose from my findings, and I've called these identities the compliant employee and the entrepreneur. And I'll talk about those identities in a moment, but I wanted to be really clear that they're only two of many identities that emerge from the research, and so I'm not proposing that these are the only two identities that teachers can take up in the sector, or even that they're the two main identities. They're just two identities that I think are interesting and problematic and will be good basis for discussion about privatisation in the sector. Overall, I found that there was no collective agreement about what it means to be an early childhood teacher in Aotearoa, that teachers' identities arose from these complex interactions and inter-animations between different discourses, between their own personal experiences and histories, between the contexts in which they worked. And that, so in the pictorial there, I've just mentioned, I've highlighted some of the discourses and influences that I found that shaped teachers' identities. So you can see there neoliberal discourse, which is the focus of this presentation, but also bicultural discourses, democratic discourses, different philosophies and pedagogies, discourses of care and of education, the influence of regulatory and performative expectations on teachers. The historical discourses of kindergarten and childcare were really influential in how teachers understood themselves and their work. And then the contextual influences of the immediate place where teachers were working at that moment in time. And so all of those influences worked in dynamic ways with particular participants to give them the context for different identities. These are the key findings of the thesis overall, and again, I'm just doing this to reiterate that what I'm going to talk to you about today is just one aspect of my doctoral thesis. So I found competing and contradictory constructions of professionalism and policy. So more than one way to be a teacher, or more than one set of expectations about how to be a teacher in early childhood policy. political and contextual nuances and engagements with discourses of care, and actually the notion of care, whether it exists or doesn't exist, whether teachers think about it as claim it as part of their identities, was quite a big finding in the thesis. The impacts of increasing regulatory and performative expectations of teachers, and then the contextual and historical influences. So the thesis has different chapters, and one chapter is about kindergarten teacher identities, and then another chapter, which I'll talk to you about today, is about teacher identities in the private sector. And I found that these to be quite distinct sets of identities for teachers. Okay, I'll just find where I'm up to in my notes. So one of the things that I did was undertake individual interviews with centre owners and managers. And what I found was that the private sector, as you'll know, is diverse in its makeup, its motivations and its organisational arrangements. So almost all of the private centre owners and managers I interviewed did not view profit as their driving motive, although there were some really notable exceptions to that in the data too. But rather, centre owners and managers talked about opportunities for autonomy and independence as a motivation for owning an early childhood centre, and thought about owning an early childhood centre as a way of enacting their own philosophies and pedagogies. But a market-based approach to provision provided this group of participants with an opportunity to have a business in which they could utilise their professional expertise and knowledge or express a particular philosophy or pedagogical approach. In most of the interview narratives, social and educational goals sat alongside and competed, sometimes in really tense ways, with the economic goals of the early childhood business. And this group of participants consistently described the juggling act they undertook between those competing priorities and the tensions that that caused for them. The participants were really eager to make distinctions between what was actually frequently called one-man bands, so individually owned and operated private centres, and what one participant called corporate juggernauts, so that, you know, the corporate side of the early childhood sector. But my findings didn't find distinct differences actually between those two settings as much as we might expect. When this group of participants talked about their work, they all included practices such as managing parental expectations of the early childhood setting, being attentive to consumer demand, centre branding, and finding and promoting points of differences for their centre. And these sorts of practices influence their work and perceptions of professionalism to different extents, but they were normalised practices for owners and teachers stepping into management positions. And so they also became key measures of professionalism for teachers and provided participants with new challenges and new opportunities for professional recognition. Notably, these ways of being seen as a professional come out of entirely different values and practices than those that have traditionally influenced teachers. And they demonstrate the ways in which neoliberal market discourses blur the boundaries between the social and the economic. So you can just see some of the voices of participants there talking about, you know, the tensions between the economic and educational goals. So one centre manager saying, so my loyalty is kind of split, I guess, because I want it to work for them, the centre owners. But then again, I also want to make sure that our families and teachers are being looked after, which financially is not always easy. At the end of the day, we're a business, we're trying to make money. However, we still try and provide quality. Our bottom line is doing the best for children and families. So centre owners and managers had different had variations in the way that they blurred the social and the economic, but nevertheless those two discourses were shaping the ways that they understood their work. The first identity that I want to talk to you about is an identity that I have called the compliant employee. But actually I think of it somewhat as the uncompliant employee, because you'll see in a minute the way that this identity was resisted by teachers. So almost all of the teachers in the focus groups had experiences working in profit-driven and highly managerial services. In these settings, they experienced hierarchical management structures, a focus on standardisation and accountability, all the hallmarks of managerialism. Participants frequently described relationships that occurred within a consumer-provider framework, poor work conditions, daily routines dominated by the clock, and low trust, low autonomy environments. These experiences and participant narratives occurred in both corporate and single owner-operator centres, suggesting that issues with privatisation emerge from the intersection of market-based approaches to provision and the discourses of managerialism, and can occur in any type of early childhood service. And in fact, there were aspects of these experiences in the narratives of kindergarten teachers that I interviewed as well. Participants recognise their positioning as commodities of centres, and you can see the quotes there where they're really feeling that positioning, feeling like they were treated as a number, just a warm body, you know, naming themselves as commodities. And they also experience strong expectations of compliance. For many participants, these experiences were dehumanising and deprofessionalising, and once they left the service, took time to recover from. One participant recalled feeling like she had failed as a teacher and wouldn't be of any value anywhere because she was so burnt out from the stress. A strong focus on managerial practices and values and consumer-provider relationships in some centres devalued teacher voices, infused social relationships within the centres, and kept teachers busy with routines and work conditions that militated against opportunities for debate and dialogue. These findings demonstrate that what occurs for teachers when the priorities of the early childhood business take precedence is a lack of professional trust leading to feelings of deprofessionalisation. The compliant employee is a consequence of early childhood policy that has not paid close enough attention to the experiences and voices of teachers across the sector, and has not adequately confronted the impact of market-based approaches on teachers' work conditions. The experiences of these teachers highlight how marketisation and managerialism provide insufficient infrastructure for the development of collective and valued teacher identities, and make it difficult for teachers to insert different alternatives and priorities. But it's not all bad. Oops, I seem to have some information missing from that slide, sorry. I read out, they were just some quotes from participants, I'll read them out for you. So although I have called this identity the compliant employee, I called this identity the compliant employee really to draw attention to the positioning and expectations of teachers in some private services. But it's not my intention to suggest that teachers are entirely disempowered. In fact, I was really interested in the idea of teacher agency in these narratives, about compliance. And I thought that I found that the compliant employee was a site of significant resistance for teachers. Participants demonstrated the extent to which they were unhappy, uncomfortable and uncertain about managerial practices and discourses. Participants described big and small acts of rebellion within centres, describing the ways in which they pushed back against managerial discourses. There were plenty of stories about how rules and expectations were ignored or bent, as well as disagreements and negotiations with centre management, and attempts to advocate for families and for themselves within the discourse of the centre. So there was plenty of examples of resistance and innovation in teachers' narratives too. I think that these small resistances are important to take note of because they likely make a difference for children and teachers at the centre and can provide space for others to follow and contribute to upsetting the balance of power. Ball and Amido comment that by acting irresponsibly, by not following the rules, these teachers take responsibility for the care of themselves, and in doing so make clear that the social reality is not as inevitable as it may seem. Their resistances were made possible through alternative identities and discourses available to them through qualifications, professional knowledge and their personal ethics. However, the extent to which they make a difference across the sector is limited because they're not widely shared and they occur within the private space of each centre, and sometimes at considerable cost to individual teachers. Participants also drew on particular alignments with philosophies and pedagogies, and these created a space from which they could reject the deprofessionalising discourse of managerialism and privatisation, and particular philosophies and pedagogical commitments allow teachers to uphold different ethics. And so you can see there some of the participant comments. For example, the comment by Talia about Reggio Emilia. However, for me, thinking about the potential for collective engagement and advocacy, a question remains about the tendency for neoliberal discourses to co-opt alternative discourses for its own purpose. Gotson, for example, points out that Reggio Emilia envisions educational spaces as democratic meeting places, pedagogical, political, social and cultural purposes. And he says this is a reverse way of thinking to neoliberalism. But he also notes that Reggio is a good marketing label for centres. It's frequently reduced to everyday methods without real connection to political or democratic aims that underpin its inception. So in the example on the slide, it's clear that being in a Reggio centre gave Talia a sense of value and purpose. But it's less clear the extent to which her move into a Reggio context has enabled her to engage with the broader politics of the sector, including tensions between ethical and the political commitments of Reggio Emilia and the practices and subjectivities of a privatised sector. The second identity that I want to talk about is this identity that I've called the entrepreneur. The most common act of resistance to teachers being positioned as compliant employees was for them to simply move on, to leave the centres and to find better work somewhere else. Therefore, the experience of being a teacher and the narratives of my participants included navigating the terrain of an uneven and sometimes unsafe work settings individually, searching for the best opportunities for themselves. Stories of centre hopping were common across the data, and I recognise that these are expressions of agency in some ways, in which participants were exercising the freedom to act and the freedom to choose, but only within the confines of a marketised and highly competitive sector. Examining these experiences illuminated an alternative identity that I call the entrepreneur. This identity emerged from narratives which suggest that teachers are individually responsible for their own status and positioning in the sector. And you see that evident in the quotes there. I've contributed to my own career because I haven't been scared to say this environment is not for me. Or people are a bit silly because they haven't done their research or they haven't read their contract. So sometimes I don't feel sorry for people because they've put themselves in that situation. And this last quote was typical of a number of experiences of teachers in the study. I just kept trying to get into kindergarten and making decisions that would lead me there. In these examples, teachers are expected to act as homo economicus in constant pursuit of self-interest. And I see that this is connected to the heightened individualism, which is a part of the neoliberal discourse. What stood out for me in participant narratives was that the responsibility for limiting organisational arrangements was shifted away from early childhood businesses and early childhood policy and onto individual early childhood teachers, whose responsibility it is to act in their best interests for their own early childhood careers, often by leveraging qualifications or commitments to particular pedagogical approaches. These individualised negotiations undermine opportunities for collective action, ultimately obscure structural injustices that impinge on teachers' work, results in high teacher turnover, is destabilising for the sector and has unknown impacts on children and whānau. Importantly, it does not resolve the issues of compliance, recognition and terrible work conditions that were so prevalent in many of the teachers' narratives. I just want to finish with some of my thinking around the key implications of these findings, and also a quote from Peter Moss. So in the conclusion chapter of my thesis, I discuss how important it is that we engage in brave and possibly confronting conversations about the commodification of early childhood and the impact of the market-based approaches to provision. How can we decommodify early childhood? Having conversations about what we want as an alternative and how we might get there. I think we need bolder policy strategies that confront and unwind the damaging effects of privatisation on teachers' work and wellbeing, and critical engagement with the official discourses of professionalism and safe spaces for this to occur. One of the things that I found was that teachers found the experience of coming together in focus groups really transformative for them, that listening to each other and having an opportunity to tell their story created a space for them to imagine something different. And it was important that those conversations occurred outside of the context of their places of employment. Thank you.
You've given us huge food for thought there.